Most of the prisons in CDCR participate in a program called the Inmate Package Program. This is a means by which inmates can have goods, items that are purchased in an outside store, sent in to the prison and delivered to them. Whenever I started doing time, these things were literally purchased by your family and sent to the prison. You would get a form called a package form, and you would take it to a sergeant, and he would check a list and make sure that you were allowed to receive a package. If you were, you would fill out the address of the person who was going to be sending it to you, and the sergeant would verify they had some relationship to you, and he would approve that they were allowed to send you some things from an outside store. Perhaps some special treats like cashews, which I always loved, or clothes, a t-shirt, which fell within the constraints of what inmates were allowed to wear, but which came from outside of the prison instead of the prison laundry. A big deal was, of course, shoes. If you could have shoes sent in from outside rather than just wearing these state boots, that was a huge thing. I remember how excited I'd been whenever Sam, the shop caller at San Quentin, had given me a pair of boots so I could trade up from a pair of jack flaps. You wouldn't believe how excited I was at the opportunity to trade from a pair of state boots to an actual pair of working shoes. Of course, eventually the administration got rid of this program and decided to just allow inmates to pay to have outside companies ship these items to them instead of having their friends and family preparing the packages. This made sense first because it made it so that the sergeants on the yard didn't have to do little mini background checks to make sure which inmates were allowed to receive packages and which inmates were not. This made their jobs a lot easier. But on top of that, it shut down a vector of introduction of contraband to the institution. On the lower security yards, canned goods were a means of introduction. You see, it was easy for somebody who had the proper equipment to can a big chunk of drugs, heroin or meth or whatever it is somebody wanted, and then just take a Campbell's soup label or something like that and put it on the outside of the can. And if this were done very carefully, realistically they could introduce pounds of contraband into the institution. Of course, on higher security yards, like where I was, B yard at High Desert, you couldn't have canned goods. So instead, the means by which you would introduce contraband is on the inside of shoes. You would have a set of shoes sent in, and you would perhaps glue or stitch a little bindle, a little plastic bag of drugs into the very tip of the shoe, or perhaps on the inside where there was some padding. And theoretically, whenever it got to the guy on the institution, he could break it out and give it to the gang, and this is just where the money would come from for the gangs. There was an occasion where this happened. Somebody had had some drugs sent in on a pair of shoes when I was at High Desert. In order to receive a package, an inmate would generally go outside of their building, cross the yard, and go to a neutral area, which was on the other side of a large fence called the program area. This area of the prison is not for general population inmates to just mill in and out. Rather, you're searched on the way in and you're searched on the way out. And there's a row of windows where you can interact with various program facilities. For instance, whenever I wanted canteen, there was a window where that you would go to for a canteen after having been searched. Similarly, packages, library, the behind-the-wall area that I've mentioned before where they did vocational training. All of these things you had to first pass one primary checkpoint, and on the other side of it is where you would get your packages. This particular inmate had a clavo of drugs that was hidden in the toe of a shoe, and whenever the cop tapped the shoes together, the drugs came loose. They didn't quite fall out of the shoe, but they were obviously there. The inmate snatched the shoes out of the cop's hand and turned and ran. And of course, the cop hit the alarm, and now everybody was looking, and you could see this inmate on the wrong side of the fence with just nothing but guards holding these shoes looking panicked. It was really obvious that he was in trouble. He took 2 running steps and picked up the shoes and threw them over the fence. Unfortunately, the dangling laces caught in the concertina wire that's above the fence, and the clavo of drugs fell onto the correct side of the fence where another inmate could have grabbed them and I guess maybe tried to find a toilet to flush them in or an open door to throw them in. But of course, at this point, the gunner was leaning out of the tower, pointing his rifle at the drugs, and there were dozens of cops screaming and running, so nobody did anything, and we all just watched them go over to the drugs and pick them up and then put the inmate in restraints. I doubt he realistically expected anybody was going to risk getting shot to try and flush his drugs down the toilet, but maybe he was a member of a gang and they'd sent the clavo to him and he had to demonstrate that he did everything he could to get the drugs to the gang so they wouldn't feel the need to, stab him to make a point about what happens when somebody doesn't get the drugs to the gang. Alternately, maybe he had 2 strikes. Maybe this was his 3rd and he was just desperate and, he was hoping somebody would find some way for him to not spend the rest of his life in prison. Either way, that guy's life was over as soon as the cop tapped those shoes together and the drugs fell to the base of the shoe. Or maybe that guy's life was over whenever he asked his friends or family to send it in to him. I don't know. Shoes were the thing that I was the most concerned about whenever I got my first package. I remember talking to somebody who'd been so excited. They were having the new Nike whatever shoes sent in. They were worth $150. And he was so proud that his friends were sending him a $150 pair of shoes. And I sincerely hope he got all of the use and joy out of those basketball shoes he could have. But I remember thinking $150 on shoes, I want traction. I want a good pair of work shoes that are going to grip these smooth concrete floors. I got a pair of New Balance work shoes. I'd worked in a kitchen before and those were my preferred shoes to work in. I walked those shoes into the dirt. I think I wore them for 3 years every single day and they made my life better and maybe even safer in 100 different ways. But the day I got those shoes, I messed up. You see, I had assumed that the shoes were going to be dropped off at my door whenever I was told that I was receiving a package. Whenever you're on lockdown, that's generally the way packages are delivered. Rather than having an inmate walk all the way from the building to the secure area on the other side of the yard and then back, because he's going to be in restraints and there's going to be an officer escorting him, because it's a lockdown. No inmates just walk around willy-nilly. The guards are in control of everything. It's an exigent situation. Unfortunately, I hadn't realized that whenever you're off lockdown, there's a different procedure. And so I walked out into the day room and then out onto the yard wearing my jack flaps, my shower shoes, with the logic that I was getting my good shoes and I'd put them on whenever I got them. I'd planned on it being 5 minutes. I hadn't realized that whenever there is yard, you can wait an hour or more to get your package. There's a line of inmates waiting to process into the neutral area where you can get your package. There's a rule. Boots on the yard. No shower shoes in the day room. No shower shoes on the yard. It's a little rule and it's very rarely broken because it's such a simple rule to follow. But it is an important rule. Boots or shoes drastically increase your combat efficacy. Somebody walking around in a pair of shower shoes or slippers, he's going to drag everybody else down with him. And it's something people are aware of. So when, and it does happen once in a long while, somebody forgets to wear their shoes out into the day room or out onto the yard, it's a done practice that it's okay to maybe step on his foot a little bit or give him an elbow in the chest and push him and see if he falls. Nothing too rough, nothing actively disrespectful, but at the same time, if somebody complains, the response is going to be, well, if you didn't want this to happen, you probably should have been wearing your boots. Thankfully, I didn't endure anything like this. I found a couple of white guys who were also waiting for a package, and I explained the situation to them, and they said I could hang out with them. Eventually, I did get my shoes, and I put them on, and I felt a lot more stable afterwards. But this was one of the very few times whenever I was checked in prison. I don't mean a hard check or a soft check or anything serious like that. What I mean is that after I had my shoes on, one of the bigger homies, the guy who had a good name on the yard and who people listened to, he came over, asked to talk to me for a sec, and he pulled me aside, and he said, pretty cliche, "Listen, Wood, you got to tighten up your program. You're making everybody look bad." Tighten it up, Wood. I understood what he meant, and he wasn't just telling me that I needed to be wearing shoes all the time. What he was telling me is that I had broken a rule, and he was explicitly telling me, don't keep breaking rules or something bad will happen to you. And I understood, and he never did have to tell me again, but that type of conversation from an authority figure, especially in a correctional environment where there's all the muscles and knives, it's intimidating. It can be a wake-up call. Whenever I'd went out, I'd only been worried maybe the riot would kick off and I wouldn't have a pair of shoes on. This kind of drove home the idea that it wasn't just other groups that I had to be worried about. My own group might mete out discipline if necessary. I remember before I was arrested on one occasion, hanging out with a friend at the camp of a homeless man we'd met earlier that day. The homeless man's shoe had basically exploded. It had just fallen off his foot whenever the last couple of stitches had broken. My friend had almost without hesitation literally taken off his boots and given them to the guy. I told him, here, you need these more than I do. We'd walked back home together. I needled him a little later. Why would you give that guy your boots? That can't have been a good choice. My friend said he didn't care, that, it's just a pair of boots and he has a better one at home anyway, and he was probably going to drop them off at Goodwill sometime soon anyway. I didn't buy any of it. When you're walking 15 miles a day, your shoes are your friends, basically. You really rely on them, and the idea that you would just glibly hand them over to someone else didn't make any sense. Finally, after I pushed just a little because I could sense the dishonesty, he told me that he was thinking about the walk home whenever he gave the guy his boots. That it was a half-mile from the bridge to where we were staying, and that half-mile he was going to have to walk barefoot. That's the first thing he thought whenever he considered giving the guy his boots, and he almost didn't do it because of that half-mile walk. And then he realized he had another pair of shoes waiting for him at the end of that half-mile. But that the homeless guy was going to be 2-3 days a week, who knew, without shoes. As he thought about that, he realized he couldn't walk home with the boots because every step was going to just drive into his heart and make him crazy. All he'd be able to think about is that other guy without shoes, not for a half hour, but for who knew how long. I'm not suggesting that anybody should give up their shoes, just give them to somebody. That's craziness. But spend that moment and really think about the things in your life, even the little things, you might not have tomorrow. I know that sounds crazy. It sounds unlikely that tomorrow you could be without a pair of boots. You could be without the roof over your head. You could be without the hand you're using to control the mouse to watch these videos. But that is life, the same way that some people just get incredibly lucky and win the lottery, their life changes in one day. Some other people get incredibly unlucky, and terrible things happen, and their life changes in one day too, and that day could literally be today for any one of us. So take that moment. Really appreciate the things that could be taken from you, because we never know when they will be.